Picture this. You're a single mother, working three jobs just to keep the lights on. When a court summons arrives with news that rocks your world, your ex-husband and the man who abandoned you while pregnant with twins is dead. But here's the twist. He was worth nearly $3 billion and you had no idea. You walk into that courtroom expecting nothing, maybe hoping for closure. Instead, you discover he left his entire fortune to his mistress, the same woman who convinced him to abandon his children. But what you don't know yet is that this betrayal is just the beginning, because hidden in a safe deposit box are recordings that will expose a web of fraud, manipulation, and murder that goes deeper than you could ever imagine. Your ex-husband didn't just die in a plane crash. He was silenced before he could reveal the truth about the woman who destroyed your family. This is the story of Sarah Mitchell, an abandoned wife who fought back against a billionaire killer and won. It's about justice, revenge, and the lengths a mother will go to protect her children's legacy. But be warned, this story gets darker before it gets lighter, and the final confrontation will leave you speechless. So buckle up, because you're about to hear how one woman brought down an empire of lies with nothing but courage and the truth. The court summons arrived on a Tuesday morning that had already begun badly for Sarah Mitchell. Her 6-year-old twins, Emma and Ethan, had been arguing over the last bowl of cereal while she tried to fix their broken toaster with a butter knife. The apartment's heating system was making those concerning rattling sounds again, and she'd received another late notice from the electric company tucked under her door. When the doorbell rang at 7:30 in the morning, Sarah's first thought was that it might be Mrs. Chen from next door, complaining about the noise. Instead, she found a process server holding an official-looking envelope with her name typed across the front in formal letters. "Sarah Mitchell?" the man asked, consulting his clipboard with the weary expression of someone who delivered bad news for a living. "That's me," Sarah said, her stomach already sinking. Legal documents in her world meant one thing: trouble she couldn't afford to handle. The man handed her the envelope and walked away without another word, leaving Sarah standing in her doorway in her worn bathrobe, holding what felt like a live grenade. Through the cracked glass of her apartment door, she could see her neighbors beginning their morning routines, oblivious to the fact that her world was about to implode. Sarah waited until Emma and Ethan had finished their breakfast and grabbed their backpacks for school before opening the envelope. Her hands were shaking as she broke the seal and unfolded the thick, cream-colored paper inside. The letterhead read, "Superior Court of California, County of Santa Clara," and the words that jumped out at her made her legs go weak. "Estate of David Mitchell, deceased." David was dead. Sarah sank into the kitchen chair that wobbled whenever anyone sat in it, the same chair she'd been meaning to fix for 3 years, but never had the time or money to replace. The summons commanded her presence at a will reading in 5 days, but all she could focus on was that single word: deceased. Her ex-husband, the father of her children, the man who had walked out of their lives 5 years ago without so much as a goodbye, was gone forever. The shock hit her in waves. First came the immediate, visceral reaction of grief for a life lost too young. David had been only 35, the same age Sarah was now. Then came the more complicated emotions: anger at him for abandoning them, confusion about why she was being summoned to his will reading, and underneath it all, a deep sadness for the man she had once loved desperately. Sarah pulled out her laptop, a second-hand device that took 3 minutes to boot up and had a screen that flickered whenever the Wi-Fi signal was weak. She Googled David Mitchell death and found herself staring at headlines that made her feel like she was reading about a stranger. Tech visionary David Mitchell dies in private jet crash. Mitchell Mine founder killed in aviation accident. Billionaire entrepreneur's life cut short at 35. Billionaire. The word hit her like a physical blow. Sarah had known that David's artificial intelligence company had been successful, but she'd deliberately avoided learning the details. Seeing his wealth quantified in news articles felt like salt in wounds that had never properly healed. The articles painted a picture of a brilliant innovator who had revolutionized machine learning and artificial intelligence. They described his company, Mitchell Mind, as one of the fastest-growing tech startups in Silicon Valley history. There were quotes from industry leaders calling him a genius, a visionary, a pioneer who would be deeply missed. None of the articles mentioned that he had children. Sarah scrolled through photo after photo of David at tech conferences, award ceremonies, and charity galas. In every image, he was accompanied by the same woman, Veronica Sterling, described as his longtime partner and business collaborator. She was stunning in the way that only unlimited money could achieve. Perfectly styled blonde hair, flawless makeup, designer clothes that fit her like they'd been crafted specifically for her body. Veronica Sterling was everything Sarah wasn't. Where Sarah had dark curly hair that she cut herself to save money, Veronica had a sleek bob that probably required weekly salon visits. Where Sarah wore clothes from thrift stores and clearance racks, Veronica wore outfits that cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. Where Sarah looked tired and worn down by the constant struggle of single parenthood, Veronica looked like she'd never had a worry in her life. The contrast was so stark it felt intentional, like David had specifically chosen someone who represented everything his old life with Sarah had lacked. Sarah found an article from 2 years earlier that made her stomach churn. It was an interview with David about work-life balance, and he'd said, "I learned early in my career that success requires complete focus. You can't build an empire while being distracted by domestic responsibilities. I've been fortunate to find a partner who understands that our shared vision for the future takes precedence over traditional family structures." Domestic responsibilities. That was how he described the children he'd abandoned. Sarah closed the laptop and tried to process what the summons meant. Why would David include her in his will after making it clear that she and the children were no longer part of his life? For 5 years, she'd received nothing from him. No child support, no birthday cards for the twins, no acknowledgement that they even existed. She remembered the last conversation they'd had, standing in this same kitchen while she was 7 months pregnant with twins she'd never planned on raising alone. David had been pacing, running his hands through his hair the way he did when he was anxious, talking about the demands of his startup and how he needed space to focus on the company's future. "This isn't working anymore, Sarah," he'd said, not even able to look at her growing belly. "I feel like I'm drowning in responsibilities I never signed up for. Veronica thinks I need to make a clean break, start fresh without the baggage of a family that's holding me back." "Baggage?" Sarah had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is that what we are to you?" "You know that's not what I meant," David had said, but they both knew it was exactly what he meant. "I'll make sure you're taken care of financially. My lawyer will contact you to work out support arrangements." The lawyer never called. David never sent money. He simply vanished from their lives as completely as if he'd never existed, leaving Sarah to figure out how to raise 2 children on her own while dealing with the emotional devastation of being abandoned by the man she thought would be her partner for life. Now, 5 years later, he was dead, and she was being summoned to hear his final words. Sarah looked around her cramped one-bedroom apartment in Oakland, taking in the peeling paint, the furniture held together with duct tape, the stack of unpaid bills on the counter. She worked 3 jobs just to keep them housed and fed. Morning shifts doing medical transcription, afternoon hours cleaning offices, and overnight data entry work when she could stay awake long enough to complete it. The irony wasn't lost on her. While David had been building artificial intelligence that could think like humans, she'd been working jobs that machines would soon make obsolete, desperately trying to stay one step ahead of automation and poverty. Emma and Ethan would be home from school in a few hours, and she'd have to figure out how to explain that the father they'd never met was dead. They'd grown up with a carefully constructed story about a daddy who lived far away and couldn't visit, but who loved them very much. It was a lie that protected them from the harsh truth. Their father had chosen his career over his family and never looked back. Sarah picked up the summons again and read the details. The will reading was scheduled for Friday morning at 10 o'clock in the offices of Henderson, White & Associates in downtown San Francisco. She'd have to take time off from work she couldn't afford to miss, pay for childcare she couldn't afford to provide, and travel to a part of the city where she'd never felt welcome. But she had to go, not for herself and certainly not for David, but for Emma and Ethan. If there was even a chance that their father had left them something meaningful, something that could help secure their futures or provide them with a connection to the man they'd never known, she had to be there to claim it. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon researching everything she could about David's death and his business empire. The plane crash had occurred during a flight from San Francisco to Los Angeles, where David was scheduled to speak at a technology conference. The preliminary investigation suggested mechanical failure, though the final report was still pending. The more she read about Mitchell Mind and David's success, the angrier she became. While she'd been working multiple jobs just to afford Emma's asthma medication, David had been living in a world of private jets and luxury that seemed almost fictional. The company he'd built was valued at nearly $3 billion, and according to the article she found, he owned a 60% stake. As she prepared dinner for the twins that evening, Emma noticed her mother's distracted mood. "Mommy, are you sad about something?" Emma asked, her green eyes so much like David's, filled with concern that no 6-year-old should have to feel for their parent. Sarah knelt down to her daughter's level, taking in the serious expression on Emma's face. "I got some news today about your daddy," she said carefully. "He died recently, and there are some grown-up things I need to take care of." Ethan looked up from his coloring book, his dark eyebrows drawn together in concentration. "The daddy we've never met?" he asked with the blunt honesty that only children possess. "Yes, sweetheart. That daddy." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "But we were going to meet him someday, right? When he wasn't so busy with his work?" Sarah's heart broke all over again. She'd told them that story so many times she'd almost started to believe it herself. "Sometimes things happen that we don't expect," she said, pulling both children close. "But what's important is that we have each other, and we're going to be okay no matter what." It was a promise she'd been making to herself and her children for 5 years, and she intended to keep it, no matter what David's final wishes might reveal. Sarah spent Wednesday evening trying to figure out what to wear to a will reading in one of San Francisco's most expensive law firms. Her entire professional wardrobe consisted of the black pants and white blouses she wore to her cleaning job, plus a single navy dress she'd bought at Goodwill for job interviews. None of it seemed appropriate for the kind of meeting where billionaires' estates were divided among heirs. She called her neighbor Maria, who worked as a receptionist at a dental office and had slightly better clothes. "I need to borrow something that makes me look like I belong in a fancy lawyer's office," Sarah explained, feeling embarrassed about having to ask. "Honey, you belong anywhere your children's father left you something," Maria said firmly. "But I've got a black dress that might work. Come over after the kids are asleep." Maria's dress was too big in the waist and too tight in the shoulders, but it was made of good fabric and looked professional enough to pass casual inspection. Sarah practiced walking in Maria's only pair of heels, wobbling around her apartment like a newborn deer until she felt confident she wouldn't fall flat on her face in front of David's lawyers. Thursday morning brought another crisis when Emma woke up wheezing, her asthma aggravated by the damp weather that had settled over the Bay Area. Sarah used the last of Emma's rescue inhaler and made a mental note to pick up a new prescription before her next paycheck, knowing she'd have to choose between the medication and groceries for the rest of the week. As she helped Emma with her breathing treatment, Sarah's mind wandered to all the ways extra money could change their lives. A reliable car instead of the ancient Honda that broke down twice a month, an apartment with heat that actually worked, and walls thick enough to muffle the neighbor's television. The ability to buy Emma's medication without having to decide what other necessity to sacrifice. But Sarah had learned not to get her hopes up. Life had taught her that expecting good things was just setting herself up for disappointment. She spent Thursday afternoon researching Henderson, White & Associates, trying to understand what kind of environment she'd be walking into. The law firm's website showcased a marble lobby, conference rooms with floor-to-ceiling windows, and attorneys who looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine spread about successful professionals. Sarah also researched Veronica Sterling, though every article she found only reinforced how outmatched she was. Veronica had graduated summa cum laude from Stanford Business School, held an MBA in venture capital, and sat on the boards of 3 major technology companies. She'd been featured on the cover of Forbes as one of the most influential women in tech, and her personal net worth was estimated at over $50 million. Meanwhile, Sarah was a community college dropout who cleaned toilets for $12 an hour. The contrast was so stark it felt like David had specifically chosen a replacement who represented everything Sarah could never be. It was as if he'd made a deliberate decision to trade in his old life for an upgrade, the way someone might replace an aging sedan with a luxury sports car. Friday morning arrived gray and rainy, matching Sarah's mood as she dropped Emma and Ethan at their after-school program earlier than usual. Mrs. Rodriguez, the program director, was understanding when Sarah explained she had a family emergency, but couldn't pay the extra fees until her next paycheck cleared. "Take care of what you need to take care of," Mrs. Rodriguez said kindly. "We'll work out the details later." The bus ride to downtown San Francisco took nearly 2 hours, including connections and delays caused by the weather. Sarah spent the time staring out Rain Street windows at a city that felt increasingly foreign as she moved from Oakland's working-class neighborhoods toward the gleaming towers of the financial district. Henderson, White and Associates occupied floors 30 through 32 of a glass and steel monument to corporate success. The building's lobby was exactly as intimidating as Sarah had expected. Marble floors that reflected crystal chandeliers, original artwork that probably cost more than most people's houses, and a reception desk staffed by young women who looked like they'd been hired as much for their appearance as their professional qualifications. Sarah announced herself to the receptionist, a blonde woman about her own age who looked at her borrowed dress and scuffed shoes with barely concealed disdain. "The Mitchell Estate meeting is in Conference Room A on the 32nd floor," the woman said without looking up from her computer. "The elevators are to your right." The elevator ride to the 32nd floor felt like ascending to another planet. Through the glass walls of the building, Sarah could see San Francisco Bay stretching toward the horizon, dotted with sailboats that probably cost more than she'd earned in several lifetimes. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, a reminder of just how far she'd fallen from the world David now inhabited. When the elevator doors opened, Sarah found herself in a hallway lined with original paintings and sculptures that belonged in a museum. The carpet under her feet was so thick she could feel her heels sinking into it with each step. Everything about the environment was designed to make visitors feel either very important or very small, depending on which side of the conference table they were meant to occupy. Conference Room A was at the end of the hall, its frosted glass doors already closed. Sarah could see shadows moving inside, hear the low murmur of voices discussing matters of business and money. She checked her reflection in the hallway mirror one last time, straightened her shoulders, and knocked on the door. "Come in," a male voice called from inside. Sarah opened the door and stepped into a room that felt like the set of a movie about powerful people making important decisions. The conference table was made of gleaming mahogany and could easily seat 15 people. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city below, while original artwork adorned the walls between built-in bookshelves filled with leather-bound legal volumes. 3 people were already seated at the far end of the table, and Sarah recognized Veronica Sterling immediately. In person, she was even more striking than in photographs, with platinum blonde hair pulled back in a sleek chignon and wearing a black designer suit that probably cost more than Sarah's annual income. Her makeup was flawless, her jewelry understated but obviously expensive, and she radiated the kind of confidence that only came from never having to worry about money. When Veronica looked up at Sarah's entrance, her ice blue eyes conducted a quick but thorough assessment, taking in every detail of Sarah's borrowed dress, discount shoes, and nervous demeanor. The look lasted only a few seconds, but it was long enough to communicate everything Veronica thought about David's former wife. "You don't belong here, and we both know it." Seated next to Veronica was an older man in an expensive gray suit who introduced himself as Robert Henderson, David's primary attorney. He stood when Sarah entered, offering a professional smile and a firm handshake. "Mrs. Mitchell, thank you for coming during what I'm sure is a difficult time. Please have a seat wherever you're comfortable." The third person was a younger woman with a laptop and legal pad who was introduced as Jennifer Walsh, an associate at the firm. She nodded politely at Sarah but didn't offer to shake hands. Sarah chose a seat several chairs away from Veronica, close enough to participate in the meeting, but far enough to avoid any direct confrontation. Even at that distance, she could smell Veronica's expensive perfume, a scent that probably cost more per ounce than Sarah spent on groceries in a month. "Before we begin," Henderson said, settling back into his chair and consulting a thick folder of documents, "I want to express my sincere condolences on David's passing. I had the privilege of working with him for several years, and his loss is felt deeply by everyone who knew him." Veronica dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, a perfect picture of elegant grief. "David was everything to me," she said, her voice carefully modulated to convey deep emotion while remaining composed. We were planning to be married next month. This is all so unexpected and devastating." Sarah felt anger flare in her chest, but kept her expression neutral. Veronica was performing grief like an actress auditioning for a role, complete with designer tissues and strategically applied makeup that enhanced rather than concealed her emotional display. Henderson opened his folder and withdrew several legal documents bound in blue covers. "David's will is relatively straightforward in its main provisions," he began, "but there are several specific bequests that need to be addressed individually. The bulk of his estate, including his controlling interest in Mitchell Mine, his real estate holdings in Palo Alto and Napa Valley, his art collection, and his investment portfolio, passes to Miss Sterling." Sarah had expected this, but hearing it stated so matter-of-factly still felt like a physical blow. David had built a fortune worth billions, and he'd left all of it to the woman who had helped him abandon his children. "However," Henderson continued, turning to a new page, "David did specifically remember his children in his will. To Emma Mitchell and Ethan Mitchell, he leaves his personal effects and what he refers to as the family property in Palo Alto." Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Personal effects might include photographs, letters, or mementos that would help Emma and Ethan understand who their father had been. And property in Palo Alto, even a small house, would be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Henderson consulted his notes and his expression became more grave. "Unfortunately, there are some complications regarding these bequests. The property in question was the house where David grew up, which he inherited from his parents several years ago. However, that house was destroyed in a wildfire 3 years ago and was never rebuilt. The insurance settlement was used to cover business expenses during a difficult period for the company." The hope died as quickly as it had bloomed. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks as she processed what Henderson had just told her. David had left his children property that no longer existed. "As for the personal effects," Henderson continued, "those items are currently in a storage facility in San Jose. According to the inventory, the collection consists primarily of childhood belongings, books from David's college years, some family photographs, and various items of sentimental rather than monetary value." Sarah stared at the lawyer, trying to understand what she was hearing. After 5 years of no contact, no support, and no acknowledgement of his children's existence, David had left Emma and Ethan a storage unit full of old books and childhood memorabilia. Veronica spoke for the first time since the reading began, her voice smooth and cultured with just a hint of manufactured sympathy. "David mentioned that he wanted his children to have something to remember him by," she said. "He felt terrible about how things had ended between you two, Sarah. He hoped that these keepsakes would help the twins understand that he had never stopped thinking about them." The condescension in Veronica's tone was unmistakable. She was speaking to Sarah the way someone might address a confused child, with exaggerated patience and barely concealed contempt. Sarah found her voice for the first time since entering the conference room. "He never stopped thinking about them, but he never sent a birthday card or $1 of child support in 5 years?" Henderson cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mrs. Mitchell, I understand your frustration, but the will reading isn't the appropriate venue for discussing past family dynamics. We're here simply to execute David's final wishes as he expressed them in his legal documents." "Of course," Sarah said, her voice hollow. She'd been naive to hope for anything different. But Henderson wasn't finished. "There is one additional matter we need to address," he said, his tone becoming more formal. "Miss Sterling's attorney has brought to our attention a document that affects the distribution of the estate." Jennifer Walsh, Veronica's lawyer, slid a paper across the table to Sarah. "Mrs. Mitchell, do you recognize this signature?" Sarah looked at the document and felt the last of her composure crumble. It was a spousal rights waiver, signed in her own handwriting 5 years earlier. She remembered the moment clearly now. She'd been at the hospital with Emma, who was running a high fever and having trouble breathing. David's lawyer had appeared with a stack of papers, explaining that they were routine insurance documents that needed to be signed to ensure the twins would be covered under David's health policy. "This document," Walsh explained with obvious satisfaction, "constitutes a legal waiver of any spousal rights Mrs. Mitchell might have claimed to David's estate. It was properly witnessed and notarized at the time of signing. I signed it thinking it was about health insurance for the children," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Your lawyer told me it was routine paperwork. The document clearly states its purpose, Walsh replied coldly. Your signature indicates that you read and understood the waiver of spousal rights to any future earnings or assets acquired during the marriage. Sarah felt trapped in a nightmare. While she'd been focused on her sick daughter, David and his lawyers had been planning to cut her out of his life completely. The document she'd signed in a hospital waiting room while worried about Emma's breathing had been a legal instrument designed to ensure she'd never have any claim to the fortune David would build. Veronica leaned forward slightly, her perfectly manicured hands folded on the table. David explained the situation to me, she said with false sympathy. He said you'd been overwhelmed by the responsibilities of motherhood and weren't really focused on legal details. He felt it was kinder to handle these matters quietly rather than putting you through a difficult divorce process. The implication was clear. Sarah had been too stupid and distracted to understand what she was signing, and David had been generous to spare her the embarrassment of a public divorce. Is the reading complete? Sarah asked, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. Henderson nodded. The estate distribution is straightforward from this point. Miss Sterling, we can schedule a meeting next week to begin the transfer process. Mrs. Mitchell, I'll have my assistant provide you with the storage facility information so you can collect the personal effects at your convenience. As the meeting concluded and people began gathering their papers, Veronica approached Sarah with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I hope you understand that this isn't personal, she said, her voice pitched low enough that the lawyers couldn't overhear. David simply outgrew his original life. It happens to successful people more often than you might think. The important thing is that everyone moves forward with grace and dignity. Sarah looked at this woman who had everything she'd lost and felt a rage so pure it scared her. Veronica had stolen her husband, contributed to the abandonment of his children, and now she was offering condescending advice about dignity while wearing jewelry worth more than Sarah's annual income. You're right, Sarah said quietly. It's not personal, it's business, and you've won. Veronica's smile became more genuine. I'm glad you see it that way. David always said you were a practical person underneath all the emotion. As Sarah walked out of the conference room and through the marble lobby of Henderson, White & Associates, she felt smaller and more defeated than she had in years. She'd known the will reading would be difficult, but she hadn't anticipated the level of calculated humiliation Veronica had orchestrated. Standing on the sidewalk outside the building, watching expensive cars navigate the downtown traffic, Sarah allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to cry. Then she dried her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and began the long journey back to Oakland, where Emma and Ethan were waiting to hear about the father who had abandoned them one final time. The bus ride back to Oakland felt endless. Sarah stared out the rain-streaked window as the gleaming towers of downtown San Francisco gave way to the more modest neighborhoods of the East Bay, her mind replaying every moment of the humiliating will reading. The borrowed dress felt like a costume she'd worn to play a role she was never meant for, and her feet ached in Maria's too small heels. By the time she reached her apartment building, Sarah had decided how she would tell Emma and Ethan about their father's final message to them. She would focus on the positive. They had photographs and mementos from his childhood, tangible proof that he had existed and that they were connected to him. She would not mention the billions of dollars that had gone to his mistress, or the way Veronica Sterling had looked at her like she was something unpleasant that had been tracked in on someone's shoe. But first, she needed to figure out how to pay for the storage unit. Mrs. Rodriguez was understanding when Sarah arrived late to pick up the twins, but she gently reminded her that the aftercare program's late fees would need to be paid by Monday. Emma and Ethan were tired and cranky from the long day, and Emma's breathing was still slightly labored despite the morning's treatment. How did the meeting go, Mommy? Emma asked as they climbed the stairs to their apartment. Her green eyes, so much like David's, were filled with the kind of hope that only children could maintain in the face of repeated disappointment. We'll talk about it after dinner, Sarah said, unlocking their door and trying to summon energy she didn't have. Why don't you both wash your hands while I figure out what we're eating tonight? The refrigerator offered few options, some leftover rice, half a bag of frozen vegetables, and eggs that were close to their expiration date. Sarah decided on fried rice, stretching the ingredients to make enough for 3 people while her children did homework at the kitchen table that wobbled whenever anyone leaned on it. As she cooked, Sarah's mind wandered to the storage unit full of David's childhood belongings. Would there be photographs of him as a boy? Letters he'd written to his parents? School reports that might give Emma and Ethan insight into their father's personality before success and Veronica Sterling had changed him? More practically, how would she get to the storage facility in San Jose? Her car was making ominous sounds that suggested another expensive repair bill was imminent, and she couldn't afford to miss more work for another trip across the Bay Area. After dinner, Sarah sat with the twins on their second-hand couch and tried to find the right words to explain their father's final gift. "Your daddy left you some special things," she began carefully. "Pictures and books and things that were important to him when he was growing up. They're in a place called a storage unit, and we'll go get them when I can arrange transportation." Ethan, always the more skeptical of the twins, frowned. "What kind of things? Like toys?" "Maybe some toys, but mostly things that will help you understand what kind of person he was before he became a grown-up. Photos of him when he was your age, books he liked to read, maybe some awards he won in school." Emma's face lit up. "Will there be pictures of us too? From when we were babies?" Sarah's heart broke a little. "I don't think so, sweetheart. These are things from before you were born, from when your daddy was a little boy." The disappointment on Emma's face was almost unbearable. Sarah pulled both children close and tried to find words that would comfort them without lying about the reality of their situation. "Sometimes grown-ups make choices that don't make sense to kids," she said. "Your daddy made some choices that hurt us, but that doesn't mean you weren't important to him. These things he left you are his way of sharing part of himself with you." Over the weekend, Sarah researched the storage facility and discovered that accessing David's unit would cost $300 in transfer fees, plus $60 per month until the contents were removed. The money might as well have been $3 million for all the access Sarah had to it. She was contemplating whether to ask Maria for another loan when her phone rang Monday morning. The caller identified himself as Marcus Webb, an attorney she'd never heard of. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm calling about David's estate. I understand you attended the will reading on Friday, but there are some additional matters we need to discuss. Would it be possible for us to meet?" Sarah's first instinct was suspicion. She'd had enough of lawyers and legal complications for a lifetime. "What kind of additional matters?" "I'd prefer to discuss this in person," Marcus said. "I was David's personal attorney for some matters that were handled separately from his business affairs. There are things about his final months that I think you should know." They arranged to meet at a coffee shop in Oakland, neutral territory that wouldn't cost Sarah money she didn't have for parking or transportation. Marcus Webb turned out to be younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, with kind eyes and a rumpled suit that suggested he cared more about substance than appearance. "Sarah," he said as he slid into the booth across from her, "I want you to know that David regretted how things ended between you. He talked about you and the children often, especially in his final months." Sarah's defenses went up immediately. She'd spent 5 years building walls around her heart to protect herself from exactly this kind of false hope. If he regretted it so much, why didn't he ever call us? Why didn't he send so much as a birthday card for the twins? Marcus sighed deeply, the sound of someone carrying a burden he'd been reluctant to share. Because Veronica Sterling convinced him that any contact would be disruptive to the children's emotional stability. She argued that opening that door would create confusion and false expectations that would ultimately harm Emma and Ethan more than his continued absence. And he believed that. David was brilliant with technology but naive about human nature, Marcus explained. Veronica is extremely persuasive, and she had strong financial incentives to keep David isolated from his past. Every connection to his old life represented a potential claim on the fortune they were building together. Marcus pulled out a tablet and showed Sarah a series of bank statements that made her head spin. "What I'm about to show you was supposed to remain confidential until the children turned 18, but given recent developments, I believe you have a right to know. David established an education trust for Emma and Ethan 3 years ago." Sarah looked at the numbers on the screen and felt her heart skip. The trust had contained over $400,000, money that would have paid for college tuition, graduate school, and given the twins opportunities Sarah could never provide on her own. "Had contained?" she asked, noticing Marcus's use of past tense. Marcus's expression grew grim. 6 months ago, Veronica convinced David to liquidate the trust and invest the funds in a new Mitchell mine venture. She claimed it would triple in value by the time the children needed it for education expenses. And did it? The venture was a shell company, Marcus said quietly. The money was funneled through a series of offshore accounts controlled by Veronica's investment firm. By the time David realized what had happened, the funds had disappeared completely. Sarah felt like someone had punched her in the stomach. Not only had David abandoned his children, but he'd also allowed his mistress to steal money that belonged to them. He let her steal from his own children? David didn't know it was theft until it was too late, Marcus said. Veronica presented the investment as a sophisticated financial strategy that would benefit the children. She showed him projections and business plans that looked legitimate. By the time he discovered the truth, the money was gone, and Veronica claimed it had been lost due to market conditions beyond anyone's control. Marcus showed Sarah another document, this one a private investigator's report that detailed systematic fraud totaling millions of dollars. David suspected that the education trust wasn't Veronica's only target. He hired investigators and discovered she'd been embezzling from Mitchell Mine through fake consulting contracts, inflated vendor payments, and unauthorized wire transfers. Sarah stared at the evidence, feeling a flicker of something that might have been hope. This proves she's a criminal. Can't we use this to get the children's money back? That's where it gets complicated, Marcus said. David was planning to confront Veronica and turn this evidence over to federal authorities. He was also planning to change his will to ensure you and the children would be provided for properly. But he died before he could take any of these actions. The hope died as quickly as it had appeared. Sarah was looking at proof that Veronica Sterling was a thief and a fraud, but it was legally meaningless without David's testimony. However, Marcus continued, leaning forward conspiratorially, there's something else. David was documenting his conversations with Veronica in his final weeks. He was building a case against her, and some of those recordings might still exist. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Where would they be? David was paranoid about digital security after discovering the embezzlement. He kept physical backups of sensitive materials in a safe deposit box that only I have access to. I haven't examined the contents yet because I needed to handle the immediate estate matters first. When can we look? Marcus hesitated. Sarah, I need you to understand the reality of what we'd be up against. Even if we find evidence of fraud, Veronica has unlimited resources and teams of lawyers. Fighting her could take years and cost more money than you have. She could drag out litigation until you're bankrupt from legal fees. Sarah thought about Emma's medication needs and Ethan's worn-out shoes and the rent that was due at the end of the week. Marcus was right. She couldn't afford a legal battle against a billionaire. But looking at the evidence of systematic theft, thinking about her children asking why their father hadn't loved them enough to stay in their lives, Sarah felt something harden in her chest. When can we check the safe deposit box? She asked again, her voice steadier than she felt. Marcus smiled for the first time since they'd sat down. Tomorrow morning, if you're available. That night, Sarah lay awake on her fold-out couch, staring at the ceiling and listening to Emma's slightly labored breathing from the bedroom she shared with her brother. For the first time in 5 years, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, David had tried to make things right in the end. If the recordings existed, if they contained evidence of Veronica's crimes, if they could somehow find a way to fight back against someone with unlimited resources, then maybe Emma and Ethan could have the future their father had originally intended for them. It was a slim hope, but it was more than Sarah had felt in years. The Bank of America branch in downtown San Francisco felt like a fortress designed to intimidate anyone who didn't belong in the world of serious money. Sarah had borrowed Maria's car for the trip, a 15-year-old Honda that made concerning noises on the freeway, but had gotten them to the city without breaking down completely. Marcus led her through a maze of marble corridors to the safe deposit box area, where they were met by a bank manager who examined their credentials with the thoroughness of a security checkpoint. The man's expression suggested he found their presence in his domain slightly suspicious, as if people like Sarah didn't typically have business with safe deposit boxes in premium locations. Box number 473, the manager announced, producing a small silver key with ceremonial gravity. Mr. Webb, As the designated co-signer, you have full access to the contents. The private viewing room is through this door. The safe deposit box area was smaller than Sarah had expected, lined with hundreds of numbered metal doors that looked like a high-security mausoleum. Marcus inserted his key alongside the bank's master key, and the small door swung open to reveal a space packed tightly with documents, electronic devices, and sealed envelopes. David was methodical about documentation, Marcus said, carefully removing items and placing them on the small table in the adjacent viewing room. He kept physical copies of everything he considered important. Sarah watched as Marcus unpacked what looked like David's entire secret life. Manila folders marked with initials and dates, external hard drives, backup phones, and a collection of small digital recording devices. There were also sealed envelopes marked with instructions like, "Open only if something happens to me," and "For Sarah's eyes only." The first folder Marcus opened contained bank statements showing suspicious transfers between Mitchell Mine accounts and various shell companies. Sarah recognized some of the names from Marcus's earlier presentation, but seeing the actual documents made the scope of Veronica's theft more real and more staggering. "Here's what David discovered about the Steinberg consulting contract," Marcus said, spreading out canceled checks and invoices. Veronica claimed this was a legitimate technology consulting firm that was helping with artificial intelligence development. David paid them $800,000 over 6 months. Marcus showed Sarah a private investigator's report proving that Steinberg Consulting didn't actually exist. It was a shell company created by Veronica using forged business licenses and fake employee records. The $800,000 had been transferred to offshore accounts controlled by Veronica's personal investment firm. "This is just one example," Marcus continued, opening another folder. "The investigators found at least 15 similar schemes. Veronica had been systematically looting the company for over 2 years. But it was the small digital recorder that made Sarah's heart race with possibility. David mentioned making recordings of his conversations with Veronica," Marcus said, holding up the device. "He wanted to document her admissions in case he needed evidence for criminal charges. Are you ready to hear what your ex-husband discovered in his final weeks?" Sarah nodded and Marcus pressed play. David's voice filled the small room, weary but determined. "Today is March 22nd. I confronted Veronica about the Steinberg contract. She insisted it was legitimate, but I showed her the investigator's report proving the company doesn't exist. Her response was illuminating." There was a pause, then David's voice continued. "She didn't deny creating the fake company. Instead, she said I was being naive about business realities. According to Veronica, successful entrepreneurs always find creative ways to maximize their personal returns from corporate success. She made it sound like I should be grateful she was teaching me how to optimize our financial strategies." Sarah felt a complex mix of vindication and sadness. David had finally seen through Veronica's manipulation, but it had taken him years to recognize what Sarah had suspected from the beginning. The recording continued. "The worst part is realizing how she's been playing me from the start. Every major business decision, every strategic partnership, every investment opportunity she's brought to me has benefited her more than the company. I've been so blinded by her intelligence and confidence that I didn't see how she was systematically positioning herself to control everything I built." Similar. Marcus fast-forwarded through several similar entries, stopping at a recording dated 3 weeks before David's death. "I've made a decision about my will," David's voice said, sounding more resolved than before. "Sarah deserves to inherit the company she helped me start with her emotional support during those crucial early years. Emma and Ethan deserve their father's legacy, not whatever scraps Veronica decides to leave them. I'm meeting with Marcus tomorrow to draft new documents that will ensure my family is protected." Sarah felt tears sting her eyes. It was too little, too late, but at least David had tried to make things right in the end. The most chilling recording was dated just 5 days before the plane crash. "Veronica suspects I'm investigating her financial activities. She's been asking questions about my meetings with Marcus, and she's suddenly very interested in my travel schedule. Yesterday, she suggested I use a different maintenance company for the plane, claiming our usual service was overbooked. I'm beginning to worry about what she might do if she realizes how much evidence I've gathered against her." Marcus stopped the recorder and looked at Sarah with an expression that was part excitement and part dread. "There are over 20 hours of recordings here. David documented systematic fraud, emotional manipulation, and what amounts to financial abuse. But there's something else. He pulled out a sealed envelope marked, "For Sarah's eyes only," in David's handwriting and handed it to her. Sarah's hand shook as she opened it and unfolded the letter inside. "Sarah," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and you're probably wondering why I destroyed our family for a woman who was destroying me." Sarah had to pause in her reading, overwhelmed by anger and grief in equal measure. "I was weak and selfish, and seduced by a lifestyle I thought I wanted. Veronica made me believe I could have everything: unlimited success, social status, freedom from domestic responsibilities, if I just focused completely on building the business. She convinced me that you and the children deserve better than a distracted husband and father who was constantly worried about company problems." The letter continued. "By the time I realized she was manipulating me to serve her own interests, I'd hurt you so badly that I didn't know how to come back. Every month that passed made it harder to reach out, until it felt impossible to bridge the gap I'd created. Veronica encouraged that distance, always suggesting that contact would be disruptive or hurtful to you and the children." Sarah forced herself to keep reading, though every word felt like a small knife to her heart. "I know now that Veronica sees me as a useful asset whose wealth and connections she can control for her own benefit. She's capable of anything to protect what she's stolen, including eliminating threats to her security. If something happens to me, please know that I never stopped loving you and our children. I was just too weak and too proud to fight for what mattered most." The letter's final paragraph made Sarah's blood run cold. "I've hidden evidence of Veronica's crimes in this safe deposit box. Use it to protect Emma and Ethan from her and to ensure they receive the inheritance I should have secured for them years ago. Don't let her win, Sarah. Don't let her destroy what's left of our family." Sarah set the letter down and stared at Marcus. "He thought she was going to kill him?" "It appears so," Marcus said grimly. "And Sarah, there's something else we need to discuss: the timing and circumstances of David's death." Marcus pulled out another folder, this one containing FAA incident reports and insurance documentation. "David's plane crash is still under investigation. The preliminary report mentioned possible mechanical failure, but the final analysis isn't complete." Sarah felt the world tilt around her. "You think Veronica sabotaged his plane?" "I think David was about to expose massive fraud and change his will to exclude Veronica completely. She had hundreds of millions of reasons to prevent that from happening, and she'd already demonstrated a willingness to commit serious crimes for financial gain." Looking at the evidence spread across the table, the recordings, the financial documents, David's final letter warning about Veronica's dangerous intentions, Sarah realized she wasn't just fighting for her children's inheritance anymore. She was fighting for justice for a man who had finally tried to do the right thing, perhaps paying for that decision with his life. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice stronger than she felt. Marcus began gathering the documents carefully. "Now we take this evidence to the FBI and let them decide whether David's suspicions were justified. But Sarah, I need you to understand what we're up against. Veronica Sterling has unlimited resources, political connections, and a team of lawyers who specialize in making problems disappear. Even with this evidence, building a criminal case will be difficult and dangerous." Sarah thought about Emma and Ethan sleeping peacefully in their small apartment, unaware that their father had died trying to secure their futures. She thought about David's letter and his warning about Veronica's willingness to eliminate threats. "How dangerous?" she asked. Marcus's expression was grave. "Veronica has already proven she's willing to commit murder to protect her interests. If she realizes we have evidence that could destroy her, she'll do whatever it takes to silence us." Despite the fear that was beginning to build in her chest, Sarah felt more determined than she had in years. For the first time since David had walked out of their lives, she had a chance to fight back against the woman who had destroyed her family. "Then we'd better make sure we succeed," she said firmly, "because my children deserve better than to grow up believing their father never loved them." As they sealed the evidence back in the safe deposit box and prepared to leave the bank, Sarah realized that her life was about to become much more complicated and dangerous. But for Emma and Ethan's sake, she was ready for whatever came next. The FBI field office in downtown San Francisco was a brutally functional building that looked like it had been designed to intimidate criminals and reassure law-abiding citizens in equal measure. Agent Jennifer Zhao was a compact woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her surroundings. She listened without interruption as Marcus presented David's evidence of financial fraud and his suspicions about the plane crash. "This is substantial circumstantial evidence," Agent Zhao said after reviewing the recordings and documents for nearly 2 hours. Mr. Mitchell clearly believed he was in danger, and his documentation of financial crimes is meticulous. However, it's not sufficient for immediate criminal charges. Sarah felt her stomach sink. After everything they discovered, after David's explicit warnings about Veronica's dangerous intentions, the FBI still couldn't act. "What would you need to build a criminal case?" Marcus asked. Agent Zhao consulted her notes. "Direct evidence of intent to commit fraud, witnesses who can testify about Miss Sterling's criminal activities, and proof that she was aware her actions were illegal rather than just questionable business practices. A good defense attorney would argue that these financial irregularities were legitimate business transactions that went bad, not intentional theft." "What about David's murder?" Sarah asked, the word feeling strange in her mouth. "The NTSB investigation is ongoing," Agent Zhao explained. "The preliminary report shows mechanical failure in the aircraft's control systems, but determining whether that failure was caused by sabotage requires extensive forensic analysis. Even if we prove sabotage, connecting it to Miss Sterling would require additional evidence." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the bureaucratic obstacles standing between her family and justice. "So there's nothing you can do?" "I didn't say that," Agent Zhao replied carefully. "We're opening a federal investigation into Miss Sterling's business practices based on the evidence you've provided. If we can establish a pattern of fraud across multiple victims in multiple jurisdictions, we might be able to build a RICO case that would carry serious penalties." Marcus leaned forward. "How long would that take?" "Months, possibly years," Agent Zhao admitted. "Financial fraud investigations are complex and time-consuming. Meanwhile, Miss Sterling could liquidate her assets and disappear to a non-extradition country." Walking out of the federal building, Sarah felt more frustrated than hopeful. Even with David's recordings and mountains of evidence, Veronica Sterling remained protected by her wealth and the slow pace of federal justice. That afternoon brought devastating news that confirmed Sarah's worst fears about Veronica's ruthless nature. She received a phone call from her supervisor at the medical transcription company. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Linda said, her voice genuinely distressed. "Corporate received several complaints about your work quality. They're downsizing the department, and your position has been eliminated." Sarah knew her work had always been exemplary. She'd been one of the company's most reliable transcriptionists for 3 years, never missing a deadline and maintaining accuracy rates above company standards. "What kind of complaints?" she asked. "Allegations of missed deadlines and transcription errors," Linda said, but her tone suggested she didn't believe the accusations either. "I fought for you, but the decision came from corporate headquarters. I'm not supposed to tell you this, but someone with serious influence made calls to our parent company." By 5 o'clock that evening, Sarah had been fired from her afternoon cleaning job as well. The story was the same: sudden complaints from clients, budget cuts, unfortunate but necessary staffing reductions. Sarah realized that Veronica Sterling wasn't just wealthy and powerful. She was also vindictive and capable of destroying lives with a few strategic phone calls. The next morning brought a visit from her landlord, Mr. Peterson, a decent man who had always been flexible when Sarah's rent was late. He stood in her doorway looking genuinely uncomfortable. "Sarah, I hate to do this, but I've received some concerning information about your legal situation," he said. "My property management company is worried about potential liability issues. They think it would be best if you found somewhere else to live by the end of the month." Sarah knew Mr. Peterson had no idea what her legal situation actually involved, and she doubted his property management company had any legitimate concerns about liability. This was Veronica's work too, another strategic move designed to isolate and destroy anyone who threatened her interests. Within 48 hours of taking David's evidence to the FBI, Sarah had lost both her jobs and her housing. She was being systematically destroyed by someone with unlimited resources and no conscience. That evening, as she tried to figure out how to explain to Emma and Ethan why they might have to move again, her phone rang. The caller identified himself as Robert Chen, an attorney representing Veronica Sterling. Mrs. Mitchell, Chen said in a cold, professional tone, my client is prepared to offer you a settlement to resolve any potential disputes related to Mr. Mitchell's estate. Sarah's pulse quickened, despite her better judgment. What kind of settlement? $100,000 paid immediately upon signing in exchange for your agreement to cease all legal action related to the estate, never publicly discuss Mr. Mitchell's business affairs or personal relationships, and surrender any materials or recordings you may have obtained. And $100,000 would solve Sarah's immediate problems and provide some security for Emma and Ethan. But it would also mean abandoning any hope of justice for David or recovery of the children's stolen inheritance. I need time to think about it, Sarah said. You have 24 hours, Chen replied. After that, the offer is permanently withdrawn. I should also mention that my client is considering filing harassment charges if you continue to spread defamatory accusations about her business practices. That night, Sarah lay awake, weighing her impossible options. Taking the settlement would mean financial security, but complete capitulation to Veronica. Refusing it would mean continued poverty and the risk of criminal charges based on Veronica's false accusations. Around 3 in the morning, she made her decision. She called Marcus and left a voicemail. I'm rejecting the settlement offer. I won't be bought off, and I won't let her intimidate me into silence. The consequences came swiftly. By the end of the week, Sarah's credit cards had been mysteriously canceled due to irregular activity. Her bank account had been frozen pending investigation of suspicious transactions, and she'd received notice that her unemployment benefits had been suspended due to discrepancies in her employment history. Sarah realized she was facing an enemy who had weaponized the entire financial system against her. Veronica Sterling didn't just have money. She had the power to make people disappear from normal society completely. But Sarah also realized something else. Veronica's increasingly desperate attacks suggested she was scared. People with nothing to hide didn't go to such lengths to silence their accusers. Every move Veronica made to destroy Sarah's life was also evidence of her guilt and her fear of exposure. The question was whether Sarah could survive long enough to use that evidence against her. With no income, no housing, and no access to her limited savings, Sarah was forced to make the humiliating call to her sister Rachel in Portland. Of course you can stay here, Rachel said immediately, though Sarah could hear the strain in her voice. Rachel was a single mother herself, working 2 jobs to support her teenage daughter in a small apartment that was barely adequate for 2 people, let alone 5. As Sarah packed their few belongings into garbage bags and prepared to uproot Emma and Ethan once again, she tried to maintain the facade that everything would be okay. But 6-year-olds were perceptive, and both children could sense their mother's fear and desperation. Are we moving because of the bad lady? Emma asked, her green eyes filled with a wisdom no child should possess. Sarah knelt down and pulled both children close. We're moving because sometimes, when people fight, innocent people get hurt, she said carefully. But we're going to stay together, and we're going to be safe. It was a promise she hoped she could keep, even as she wondered how much more of Veronica's assault her family could withstand. Rachel's apartment in Portland was a study in how far goodwill could stretch before breaking. The 1-bedroom space that had been cramped for Rachel and her 16-year-old daughter Megan became almost unlivable with the addition of Sarah and the twins. Air mattresses filled the living room, leaving narrow pathways between furniture that had been pushed against the walls to create sleeping space. Rachel worked double shifts at a packaging plant while Megan attended high school and helped with her younger cousins. The arrangement was temporary, everyone agreed, but temporary had a way of becoming permanent when money was scarce and options were limited. Sarah spent her days job hunting with increasingly desperate intensity. She applied for positions at grocery stores, fast food restaurants, and cleaning services, but somehow word of her legal troubles preceded her everywhere. Potential employers would seem interested during phone interviews, then suddenly become unavailable when she arrived for in-person meetings. Emma's asthma worsened in the damp Pacific Northwest climate, and without health insurance, Sarah had to choose between buying her daughter's medication and contributing to grocery expenses. The stress was showing on both children. Ethan had started wetting the bed again, and Emma asked daily when they would go home, not understanding that home no longer existed. 3 weeks into their stay in Portland, Marcus called with news that sent Sarah's emotions spinning between hope and despair. "I've been contacted by Jennifer Park, a former Mitchell Mine employee," he said. "She reached out after seeing news coverage about David's death. She claims to have information about Veronica that could be crucial to our case." They arranged to meet at a coffee shop in downtown Portland, where Jennifer turned out to be a nervous woman in her 30s with the kind of technical intelligence that lit up when she discussed computer systems, but dimmed when forced to navigate human politics. "I should have spoken up years ago," Jennifer began, her voice barely above a whisper, as she constantly checked the coffee shop entrance as if expecting surveillance. "But Veronica Sterling destroyed my career when I tried to question her business practices, and I was afraid of what she might do if I continued to oppose her." Jennifer explained that she'd been Mitchell Mine's lead software engineer until she discovered discrepancies in the company's code repositories. Sections of proprietary software had been copied and sold to competitors through shell companies controlled by Veronica's investment firm. "Veronica was literally selling David's innovations to his business rivals," Jennifer said. "When I brought it to David's attention, he confronted her, but she convinced him I was trying to sabotage the company out of professional jealousy and romantic interest in him." "Why would she think you were romantically interested?" Sarah asked. Jennifer looked uncomfortable. "Because I'd made the mistake of telling a coworker that I thought David was making a serious error getting involved with Veronica personally and professionally. Word got back to her, and she used it to discredit everything I discovered about her criminal activities." The story was painfully familiar to Sarah. Veronica's manipulation tactics seemed to follow a consistent pattern. Isolate David from anyone who might expose her true nature, then use his emotional attachment to her to explain away any criticism as jealousy or vindictiveness. "I have backup copies of the evidence I gathered," Jennifer continued. "I kept everything, thinking someday I might need to prove what really happened. After David's death, I realized I might be the only person left who could expose what Veronica has been doing." Marcus leaned forward. "Would you be willing to testify about what you witnessed?" "If it means stopping her from destroying more lives, yes," Jennifer said firmly. "But you should know that Veronica has been preparing for this possibility. She's been moving money offshore and creating legal barriers to protect herself from prosecution." Jennifer showed them a news article on her phone that made Sarah's heart sink. Veronica had announced that she was selling her stake in Mitchell Mine to a consortium of international investors, liquidating her assets in preparation for what she described as a new chapter in my life focused on global philanthropy. Sarah stared at the article, feeling despair wash over her. Veronica was getting away with everything, converting her stolen wealth into untouchable offshore accounts before anyone could stop her. "There's more," Jennifer said quietly. "I think David's death wasn't an accident." The coffee shop suddenly felt too loud, too public. Sarah gripped her cup with shaking hands, afraid to hear what Jennifer might reveal. "David called me 3 days before he died," Jennifer continued. "He apologized for not believing me about Veronica and said he was going to make things right." "He was scared, Sarah. Really scared. He said Veronica had figured out he was investigating her and that he didn't trust anyone around him anymore." "Did he say anything specific about feeling threatened?" Marcus asked. Jennifer nodded. "He said his plane was being serviced by a company Veronica had recommended instead of his usual maintenance crew. He thought it was suspicious, but he didn't have time to investigate before his scheduled flight to Los Angeles." Sarah felt rage and grief warring in her chest. David had died because he'd finally tried to do the right thing, and now Veronica was preparing to escape with everything she'd stolen. "We have to stop her," Sarah said, her voice stronger than she felt. "How?" Marcus asked. "Even with Jennifer's testimony, building a criminal case will take months. Veronica will be long gone by then, probably in a country with no extradition treaty." Sarah looked at the news article again, studying the details of Veronica's planned asset liquidation. There had to be something they could use, some weakness in her seemingly perfect escape plan. "What if we force her to come to us?" Sarah said slowly, an idea forming. "What if we create a situation where she has to defend herself publicly before she can disappear?" Marcus frowned. "What are you thinking?" Sarah pointed to another article on Jennifer's phone, this one announcing that Veronica would be holding a press conference the following week to discuss her departure from Mitchell Mind and her future philanthropic plans. She wants to control the narrative, Sarah said. She's going to present herself as the grieving partner, making a noble sacrifice for the good of the company. But what if we hijack her narrative? What if we force her to answer questions about David's recordings and the evidence of fraud? Marcus looked skeptical. How do we get the media to ask those questions? Sarah smiled for the first time in weeks, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. We give them a story they can't ignore. We make Veronica Sterling's press conference the most interesting event in Silicon Valley that week. Jennifer leaned forward, intrigued despite her nervousness. What did you have in mind? I'm thinking, Sarah said, that it's time for Veronica Sterling to learn what it feels like to be ambushed by someone she underestimated. Over the next few days, Sarah, Marcus, and Jennifer developed a plan that was audacious, risky, and probably their only chance to stop Veronica before she vanished with David's fortune. The plan required perfect timing, absolute secrecy, and the cooperation of people who had no reason to trust Sarah, but every reason to want Veronica exposed. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. As Sarah prepared to return to San Francisco for what might be her final confrontation with the woman who had destroyed her family, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not hope for reconciliation or closure, but hope for justice. Hope that David's final attempt to protect his children would succeed. Hope that sometimes when you fight back against impossible odds, you might actually win. The war was about to begin in earnest, and this time Sarah intended to be the one left standing when it ended. Sarah's plan required allies she didn't have and credibility she'd lost. But it also had one crucial advantage: Veronica Sterling's arrogance. The woman who had systematically destroyed Sarah's life was so confident in her superiority that she couldn't imagine a threat from someone she considered beneath her notice. The key was Michael Torres, an investigative reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle who specialized in Silicon Valley corruption. Sarah had researched his work extensively and found someone who had built a career exposing the dark side of tech wealth. Torres had written scathing pieces about insider trading, labor violations, and environmental cover-ups by major technology companies. Sarah called Torres and pitched her story with the desperation of someone who had nothing left to lose. A grieving widow with evidence that her late husband's business partner had been systematically defrauding the company and may have been involved in his death. That's a serious accusation, Torres said after listening to Sarah's summary. What kind of proof do you have? Audio recordings of my husband documenting the fraud, financial records showing systematic theft, and witness testimony from former employees who can confirm the pattern of criminal behavior. I also have evidence suggesting my husband's death may not have been accidental. Torres agreed to meet them the next day at a diner in downtown San Francisco, far from the gleaming towers where Veronica held court. Sarah, Marcus, and Jennifer spread their evidence across a sticky table, while Torres listened with the focused intensity of a predator sensing vulnerable prey. This is explosive material, Torres said finally, reviewing David's recordings and the financial documentation Jennifer had preserved. But I need to verify everything independently and find at least 2 additional sources who can corroborate the fraud allegations. Jennifer provided contact information for 3 other former Mitchell Mind employees who had witnessed Veronica's suspicious activities but had been too intimidated to speak publicly. Torres spent the next 2 days conducting interviews, fact-checking financial records, and building a story that would destroy Veronica's carefully crafted public image. I can have the article ready by Friday morning, Torres told Sarah during a tense phone call. But I need you to be prepared for the consequences. Veronica Sterling has unlimited resources and will use them to destroy anyone who threatens her. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Sarah thought about Emma and Ethan sleeping on air mattresses in Rachel's crowded apartment, about David's final letter warning her to protect their children from Veronica, about the systematic campaign of intimidation that had already cost them everything they had. I'm sure, she said. Veronica's press conference was scheduled for Friday at 10 in the morning at the St. Francis Hotel in downtown San Francisco. Torres planned to time his article's publication for maximum impact, releasing the story just as Veronica began speaking to ensure maximum media attention. The morning of the press conference, Sarah stood outside the hotel watching news vans and reporters gather for what they expected to be a routine business announcement. She wore the same borrowed dress she'd worn to the will reading, but this time it felt like armor rather than a costume. Marcus stood beside her, carrying a briefcase full of backup evidence in case they needed to provide additional documentation. "Are you ready for this?" he asked. Sarah watched as Veronica Sterling's limousine pulled up to the hotel entrance. Even from a distance, she could see the other woman's confidence, the way she moved through the world like she owned everything she touched. "I've been ready for this since the day she stole my husband and abandoned my children," Sarah said. Inside the hotel ballroom, Veronica commanded attention from a podium flanked by elaborate flower arrangements and expensive-looking microphones. She looked perfect as always, wearing a navy blue suit that probably cost more than Sarah's annual income in jewelry that caught the light whenever she moved her hands. "Ladies and gentlemen," Veronica began, her voice clear and confident, "today marks the end of an era and the beginning of an exciting new chapter. As you know, the tragic loss of my dear partner David Mitchell has left all of us at Mitchell Mine grieving and searching for the best way to honor his memory." Sarah listened from the back of the room as Veronica painted herself as the devoted partner making a noble sacrifice for the good of the company. It was a masterful performance, every word calculated for maximum sympathy and minimum scrutiny. Then Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Torres. "Article is live. Check your email." Sarah opened the San Francisco Chronicle's website and saw the headline that would destroy Veronica's world. "Tech billionaire's widow alleges murder plot in partner's death." The article laid out everything. David's recordings documenting systematic fraud, the stolen children's trust fund, the pattern of embezzlement, and serious questions about the circumstances surrounding his death. Around the ballroom, Sarah could see reporters checking their phones and tablets, their expressions changing as they absorbed Torres's explosive revelations. The energy in the room shifted palpably, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air becomes charged with electricity. A reporter in the front row stood up, her voice cutting through Veronica's prepared remarks. "Miss Sterling, how do you respond to allegations that you embezzled millions from Mitchell Mine through fraudulent consulting contracts?" Veronica's composure cracked for just a moment before she recovered, but it was long enough for everyone in the room to notice. "I'm not aware of any such allegations," she said, her voice slightly less steady than before. "This press conference is about honoring David's legacy and the future of the company, not addressing baseless rumors." Another reporter jumped in before Veronica could regain control. "What about recordings of David Mitchell documenting systematic fraud? Are you claiming he was lying about your business practices?" Sarah watched as Veronica's perfect mask began to slip. The other woman's eyes scanned the room, looking for an escape route, but the reporters were pressing closer like predators sensing wounded prey. "These allegations are clearly the desperate fabrications of a bitter ex-wife seeking to profit from tragedy," Veronica said, her voice rising slightly as her composure continued to deteriorate. "David Mitchell divorced his first wife years ago and moved on with his life. Any claims she's making are motivated by jealousy and greed." That was Sarah's cue. She stood up in the back of the room, and every camera in the ballroom swiveled toward her. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room. "I'm David's widow and the mother of his children, and I have evidence that everything Miss Sterling just said is a lie." The ballroom erupted into chaos as reporters surged toward Sarah, shouting questions and jostling for position. Camera flashes strobed like lightning as Sarah stood her ground, Marcus beside her with the briefcase full of damning evidence. "Mrs. Mitchell," a reporter called out, "what evidence do you have to support these fraud allegations?" Sarah had rehearsed this moment in her mind for days, but facing dozens of cameras and microphones still felt surreal. "I have over 20 hours of audio recordings my husband made documenting systematic theft by Miss Sterling. I also have financial records showing how she stole $400,000 from a trust fund intended for our children's education." At the podium, Veronica grabbed the microphone with both hands, her knuckles white with tension. "This is a pathetic attempt by a woman who was abandoned by her husband to profit from his death," she snarled, all pretense of grief abandoned. "David made it clear years ago that he wanted nothing to do with his former life or the children from his first marriage." "That's not true," Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger as her anger built. David was planning to change his will and expose your crimes when he died. He left recordings describing how you manipulated him and warning that you might try to have him killed. The accusation of murder hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Reporters began shouting questions about conspiracy and assassination, while hotel security moved through the crowd trying to maintain some semblance of order. Veronica's response was more telling than any denial could have been. "You can't prove anything," she screamed, abandoning all pretense of composure. "David is dead, and dead men can testify against the living. Whatever fantasies you've constructed in your bitter little mind, you'll never be able to prove them in court." It was an admission disguised as a denial, and everyone in the room heard it. Sarah saw recognition dawn on the faces of the reporters, the understanding that they were witnessing something much darker than corporate fraud. FBI agent Jennifer Zhao chose that moment to enter the ballroom with two other federal agents. Their timing coordinated perfectly with Torres's article and Sarah's confrontation. "Miss Sterling," Agent Zhao called out, her voice cutting through the chaos, "we'd like to speak with you about irregularities in your business dealings and the circumstances surrounding David Mitchell's death." Veronica looked at the agents, then at the crowd of reporters, then back at Sarah. For the first time since Sarah had known of her existence, Veronica Sterling looked genuinely afraid. "I want my lawyer," she said, but her voice was small and defeated. As the agents approached the podium and the reporters pressed forward with their cameras and questions, Sarah felt a profound sense of justice beginning to take shape. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time in months, she believed it might actually end with Veronica paying for her crimes. The aftermath of the press conference was swift and merciless. Within hours, footage of Veronica Sterling's public meltdown was trending on social media, her carefully crafted image as a grieving partner and brilliant businesswoman crumbling under the weight of Sarah's accusations and the FBI's very public interest in her activities. Sarah watched the coverage from Marcus's office, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion as cable news channels replayed Veronica's breakdown on an endless loop. The woman who had once seemed untouchable was now the subject of federal investigation, media scrutiny, and public speculation about her role in David Mitchell's death. "The FBI moved faster than I expected," Marcus said, reviewing updates from Agent Zhao. "They've already secured warrants to search Veronica's offices and freeze her financial accounts. The evidence you provided gave them probable cause to move immediately." But Sarah's satisfaction was tempered by a phone call that reminded her how dangerous their enemy remained. The voice on the other end was cold and professional, belonging to someone who identified himself only as a representative of Miss Sterling's interests. "Mrs. Mitchell," the man said, "my client wishes you to know that your recent actions have been noted. False accusations against public figures can have serious legal consequences, including charges of defamation, harassment, and conspiracy. My client hopes you'll reconsider your current course of action before these matters escalate further." "Are you threatening me?" Sarah asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm providing information about potential legal consequences," the man replied. "What you do with that information is your choice." After the call ended, Sarah realized that exposing Veronica publicly had only made her more dangerous. A cornered billionaire with everything to lose was not someone to underestimate, especially one who had already demonstrated a willingness to commit murder. Agent Zhao called that evening with an update that was both encouraging and terrifying. "We've made significant progress in the last 48 hours, she said. "We've identified the maintenance company that serviced David's plane before the crash. The owner has agreed to cooperate with our investigation in exchange for immunity." "What did he tell you?" Sarah asked. "He confirmed that Veronica Sterling paid him $50,000 to install a device that would cause the plane's control systems to fail during flight. He kept records of the transaction and still has the device specifications. It's enough to charge her with first-degree murder." Sarah felt a complex mix of vindication and horror. David had been right to be afraid. Veronica had literally murdered him to protect her criminal empire. "However," Agent Zhao continued, "Veronica's lawyers have filed motions claiming that our investigation is based on fabricated evidence provided by a vindictive ex-wife. They're arguing that David's recordings were altered and that the financial irregularities were legitimate business transactions that went bad." "Can they make those arguments stick?" Marcus asked, joining the conversation on speakerphone. With unlimited resources and the best legal team money can buy, they can certainly try, Agent Zhao admitted. That's why we need to move quickly. We're planning to arrest Veronica tomorrow morning, but we wanted to warn you that she might attempt to retaliate before then. Tori. The warning proved prophetic. At 3 in the morning, Sarah was awakened by the sound of breaking glass in Rachel's apartment. She crept to the living room window and saw two men in dark clothing attempting to break into Rachel's car, which was parked directly beneath the twins' bedroom window. Sarah called 911, but by the time police arrived, the men had vanished. Nothing had been stolen from the car, but the message was clear. Veronica knew where Sarah was staying and was willing to escalate her intimidation tactics. "We need to get you somewhere safe," Agent Zhao said when Sarah called to report the incident. "Veronica Sterling is desperate enough to try anything at this point." The FBI arranged for Sarah and the twins to stay at a safe house in Marin County while they prepared to arrest Veronica. It was a modest ranch home in a quiet neighborhood, watched over by federal agents who tried to make their protection seem like a normal part of daily life. Emma and Ethan were confused by the sudden move, but excited by what felt like an adventure. They didn't understand that they were being protected from a woman who might try to hurt them to silence their mother. "Why are we hiding from the bad lady?" Emma asked as Sarah tucked her into an unfamiliar bed. "We're not hiding," Sarah said carefully. "We're just staying somewhere safe while some grown-up problems get solved." The next morning brought news that Sarah had been waiting for. Veronica Sterling had been arrested at her Palo Alto mansion on charges of first-degree murder, fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The arrest had been captured by news cameras, showing Veronica in handcuffs being led to a federal vehicle, while reporters shouted questions about David's death and the missing money. But Veronica's arrest was only the beginning. Her lawyers immediately filed for bail, arguing that she was not a flight risk and that the charges were based on unreliable evidence. A federal judge granted bail at $10 million, which Veronica's family posted within hours. "She's out," Agent Zhao called to inform Sarah. "Her passport has been surrendered and she's under electronic monitoring, but she's not in custody anymore." Sarah felt fear creep back into her chest. A woman who had already committed murder to protect her secrets would not hesitate to eliminate the witnesses who could destroy her completely. The next few days passed in a blur of depositions, interviews, and legal preparations. Sarah found herself at the center of a federal case that would determine whether justice could prevail against unlimited wealth and influence. Jennifer Park proved to be a crucial witness, providing technical evidence of how Veronica had stolen and sold Mitchell Mine's proprietary software. Other former employees came forward with additional testimony about Veronica's suspicious activities, creating a pattern of criminal behavior that was difficult to dismiss. But Veronica's defense team was formidable. They argued that David Mitchell had been mentally unstable in his final months, that his recordings were the paranoid fantasies of a man suffering from depression and anxiety. They claimed that Sarah was a vindictive ex-wife seeking to profit from tragedy, and that the federal charges were based on fabricated evidence. "They're trying to put David's mental state on trial," Marcus explained after a particularly brutal day of depositions. "If they can convince a jury that he was psychologically unreliable, they can discredit all of his evidence." Sarah realized that the courtroom battle would be as much about David's character and credibility as about Veronica's crimes. The woman who had manipulated him in life was now trying to destroy his reputation in death. As the trial date approached, Sarah tried to prepare herself for what would essentially be a public examination of her failed marriage and David's betrayal of their family. She would have to testify about intimate details of their relationship, explain why she had signed documents she didn't understand, and defend David's mental state while acknowledging that he had abandoned his children. It was going to be the most difficult thing she had ever done, but it was also her only chance to secure justice for David and financial security for Emma and Ethan. The night before the trial began, Sarah sat in the safe house looking at photographs of David from before their divorce. In the early pictures, he looked happy and optimistic, the kind of man who would read bedtime stories and dream about building tree houses for his children. Somewhere along the way, that man had been lost, replaced by someone who could walk away from his family for the promise of wealth and status. But in his final weeks, David had tried to find his way back to the person he used to be. Sarah's job now was to make sure his final act of redemption counted for something. Tomorrow, she would walk into a federal courtroom and face the woman who had destroyed her family, armed with nothing but the truth and David's desperate attempt to make things right. It would have to be enough. The federal courthouse in San Francisco had been transformed into a media circus. News vans lined the streets, reporters jostled for position on the courthouse steps, and protesters carried signs supporting both sides of what had become known as the trial of the century. Sarah had to be escorted through a back entrance to avoid the cameras and shouted questions. The courtroom itself was packed with journalists, legal observers, and spectators who had won the lottery for public seating. Judge Patricia Williams, a stern woman in her 60s with a reputation for running a tight courtroom, surveyed the chaos with obvious displeasure. "This is a criminal trial, not a television show," Judge Williams announced before proceedings began. "Anyone who disrupts these proceedings will be removed immediately and permanently." Veronica Sterling sat at the defense table surrounded by a team of 6 attorneys, each one representing millions of dollars in legal firepower. She looked smaller than Sarah remembered, her usual commanding presence diminished by the orange jumpsuit she was required to wear during trial proceedings. The prosecution's opening statement, delivered by Assistant U.S. Attorney Elizabeth Chen, laid out a methodical case of greed, manipulation, and murder. Chen walked the jury through David's recordings, the financial evidence of fraud, and the testimony that would prove Veronica had orchestrated David's death to protect her criminal empire. "Ladies and gentlemen," Chen said, facing the jury with quiet confidence, "this case is about a woman who was willing to commit murder rather than face the consequences of her crimes. Veronica Sterling stole millions of dollars from the company she was supposed to help lead. When David Mitchell discovered her theft and threatened to expose her, she had him killed." The defense's opening statement, delivered by celebrity criminal attorney Harrison Gold, painted a completely different picture. According to Gold, David Mitchell had been a paranoid, unstable man whose marriage had failed because of his inability to handle success. Veronica Sterling was the victim of a vindictive ex-wife's imagination, in a federal prosecution desperate for headlines. David Mitchell was a brilliant man who suffered from severe mental health issues in his final months, Gold told the jury. His recordings are the paranoid fantasies of someone who had lost touch with reality. Veronica Sterling loved David Mitchell and is devastated by his death, but she cannot be held responsible for the tragic mental breakdown that led to his paranoid accusations. Sarah was the prosecution's first witness, and walking to the witness stand felt like the longest journey of her life. Every eye in the courtroom was focused on her, including Veronica's cold blue stare that seemed designed to intimidate her into silence. Under Elizabeth Chen's gentle questioning, Sarah told the story of her marriage to David, their early happiness, and the gradual changes that led to his abandonment of their family. She described finding out about his wealth through news reports, the humiliating will reading, and her discovery of evidence that Veronica had been systematically defrauding the company. "Mrs. Mitchell," Chen asked, "in your opinion, was your ex-husband mentally stable enough to understand what he was documenting in those recordings?" "David was hurt and angry about being manipulated," Sarah replied, "but he was absolutely clear about what Veronica was doing. He understood that she had been stealing from the company and that she might try to harm him if he exposed her crimes." Harrison Gold's cross-examination was brutal and personal. He attacked Sarah's credibility, her motivations, and her qualifications to judge David's mental state. He suggested that she was lying about the recordings to get revenge against the woman who had won David's affections. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Mitchell, that you've been consumed with jealousy and hatred toward Miss Sterling since your husband left you for her?" Gold asked. "My husband didn't leave me for her," Sarah replied firmly. "She manipulated him into abandoning his family so she could control his wealth. David realized that in the end, which is why she had him killed." "Objection," Gold called out. "The witness is speculating." "Sustained," Judge Williams ruled. "The jury will disregard that last statement." But Sarah could see that her words had registered with the jurors. Several of them were looking at Veronica with new interest, seeing her not as a grieving partner, but as a calculating predator. Jennifer Park's testimony provided crucial technical evidence of Veronica's software theft, while other former Mitchell Mine employees described the pattern of suspicious financial transactions. The maintenance worker who had sabotaged David's plane delivered devastating testimony about Veronica's direct role in planning the murder. She gave me detailed instructions about how to make the control system failure look like an accident, he testified. She said it was important that no one suspected sabotage, and she paid me an extra $25,000 to ensure I would never talk about our arrangement. But Veronica's defense team fought back with expert witnesses who challenged every aspect of the prosecution's case. They brought in psychiatrists who testified that David's recordings showed signs of paranoid delusion, forensic accountants who argued that the financial irregularities could be explained by legitimate business practices, and aviation experts who claimed the plane crash could have been caused by mechanical failure rather than sabotage. The trial lasted 6 weeks, with each day bringing new revelations and dramatic testimony. Sarah attended every session, watching as the evidence mounted against Veronica, while her defense team worked desperately to create reasonable doubt. The turning point came when the prosecution played David's final recording, made just 2 days before his death. His voice filled the courtroom, clear and rational despite his obvious fear. "If something happens to me, I want everyone to know that Veronica Sterling is responsible. She's been stealing from my company for years, and when I threatened to expose her, she started making arrangements to have me killed. I'm not paranoid or delusional. I'm a man who finally saw the truth about someone I trusted, and now I'm going to pay for that knowledge with my life." Several jurors were visibly emotional as they listened to David's final words. Sarah saw Veronica's face tighten with anger and fear, the mask of innocence finally slipping completely. During closing arguments, Elizabeth Chen painted Veronica as a cold-blooded killer who had manipulated David Mitchell for years before murdering him to protect her criminal empire. Harrison Gold argued that the prosecution had failed to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt and that Veronica was the victim of circumstantial evidence and vindictive accusations. The jury deliberated for 3 days, during which Sarah barely slept or ate. The safe house felt like a prison as she waited to learn whether justice would prevail or whether Veronica's wealth and influence would allow her to escape consequences once again. When the jury returned with their verdict, the courtroom was so quiet that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. The foreman stood and looked directly at Veronica as he spoke. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted in chaos as reporters rushed to file their stories and spectators reacted to the verdict. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she realized that David's final attempt at redemption had succeeded. Veronica Sterling would spend the rest of her life in prison, and Emma and Ethan would inherit the fortune that should have been theirs from the beginning. Justice, Sarah realized, sometimes took longer than expected, but it was worth the wait. 6 months after Veronica Sterling was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, Sarah stood in the conference room of a different law firm, this one representing her interest in recovering the assets that Veronica had stolen. The civil lawsuits had been swift and decisive, with courts ordering the return of not only the Children's Trust Fund, but also significant punitive damages from Veronica's seized assets. The woman who had once seemed untouchable was now inmate number 47921 at the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California, spending her days in a 6-by-8-foot cell instead of a Pacific Heights penthouse. "The final settlement amount is $12.7 million, announced Patricia Kim, the attorney handling the estate recovery. "This includes the original trust fund, interest, punitive damages, and David's share of Mitchell Mine that was fraudulently transferred to Miss Sterling." Sarah stared at the number on the documents, still struggling to comprehend the transformation of their circumstances. From sleeping on air mattresses in Rachel's apartment to becoming one of the wealthiest families in California seemed impossible, like something that happened to other people in movies. Emma and Ethan, now 7 years old and finally enrolled in an excellent private school, had adapted to their new life with the resilience that only children possessed. They lived in a beautiful house in Palo Alto, the same neighborhood where David had once planned to build their dream home. But they still asked for the same bedtime stories and worried about the same childhood concerns. "Mommy," Emma had asked just the night before, "now that we have lots of money, does that mean Daddy really loved us?" It was the kind of question that broke Sarah's heart with its innocence. "Money doesn't prove love, sweetheart," she had explained. "Your daddy loved you before he made any money, and he would have loved you even if he never made any money." Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that have nothing to do with how much they love their children. Sarah had used part of the settlement to establish the David Mitchell Foundation, dedicated to supporting abandoned families and funding legal advocacy for people fighting powerful interests. The foundation's first major project was a legal clinic that provided free representation to victims of corporate fraud and domestic violence. "I want to make sure other families don't have to fight alone the way we did," Sarah explained to the foundation's board of directors, which included Marcus Webb and Jennifer Park. "David made mistakes, but his final actions saved not just our family, but potentially countless others who were being victimized by people like Veronica." The foundation had already helped dozens of families, providing legal representation, financial support, and the kind of resources that Sarah had desperately needed during her darkest months. It felt like the best possible use of money that had been stolen from others and recovered through justice rather than luck. Marcus had become more than just the family attorney. He was a trusted friend who helped Sarah navigate the complexities of sudden wealth while staying grounded in the values that had sustained her through poverty and struggle. "David would be proud of what you've built," he told her as they reviewed the foundation's annual report. "You've taken something that came from pain and turned it into hope for other people." Sarah had also used the settlement to establish college funds for Emma and Ethan that could never be touched by anyone else, ensuring that their education and future opportunities were permanently secured. But she was careful not to let wealth insulate them from understanding the value of work, kindness, and empathy. "We have a responsibility to use our good fortune to help others," she taught them. "Money is a tool, not a trophy. What matters is what you build with it." On the first anniversary of Veronica's conviction, Sarah visited David's grave for the first time since his funeral. She brought Emma and Ethan, who placed flowers on the headstone while she stood quietly, trying to find words for a conversation she'd never expected to have. "I forgive you," she said finally, speaking to the granite marker that bore David's name and dates. "Not because what you did wasn't wrong, but because holding on to anger was hurting me more than it was hurting you. You tried to make things right in the end, and that has to count for something." Emma looked up at her mother with those green eyes that were so much like David's. "Are you still sad about Daddy?" "I'm sad about the time we lost," Sarah admitted. "But I'm grateful for the time we had, and I'm grateful that he found a way to take care of you even after he was gone." As they walked back to their car, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them from despair to hope, from poverty to security, from abandonment to justice. It hadn't been the life she'd planned, but it was a life with meaning and purpose. That evening, Sarah sat with the twins in their comfortable living room, reading them the same bedtime stories she'd read when they lived in the cramped Oakland apartment. The stories were the same, but everything else had changed in ways both large and small. "Mommy," Ethan said as she tucked him into bed, "do you think we're going to be okay now?" Sarah smiled and kissed his forehead. "Sweetheart, we were always going to be okay because we have each other. The money just makes it easier to help other people be okay too." As she turned off the lights and listened to her children's quiet breathing, Sarah thought about the letter David had left warning her to protect Emma and Ethan from Veronica's influence. She had done more than protect them. She had fought back and won, ensuring that they would grow up knowing their father had loved them enough to sacrifice everything to secure their futures. The abandoned wife who had once sat in a lawyer's office feeling humiliated and powerless had become a woman who could protect not only her own children, but countless other families facing similar struggles. Sometimes the greatest victories came not from getting what you wanted, but from discovering strength you never knew you possessed. Veronica Sterling had tried to erase David's family from his legacy, but in the end, she had only succeeded in proving that love, justice, and determination could triumph over greed, manipulation, and murder. Sarah Mitchell had not just survived her husband's betrayal and his killer's vengeance, she had transformed both into a force for good that would help other families for generations to come. And that, she realized as she drifted off to sleep in her safe, warm home, was a legacy worth building. Sarah Mitchell's journey from abandoned wife to victorious advocate proves that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply refusing to stay silent. If this story of courage and determination moved you, hit that like button to support content that celebrates real justice. Share this with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to fight back against those who think they're untouchable. And if you want more incredible true stories of underdogs taking on the powerful and winning, subscribe and ring that notification bell. Because every week we bring you stories that remind us why truth and justice still matter in this world. Your support helps us keep telling these important stories, so thank you for being part of this community that believes in the power of standing up for what's right.